Hello and welcome to our world building series. In this episode, we're going to talk about the different methods for world building. Alright, so we already touched a little bit on this subject in the previous episode, so if you haven't watched that episode, you can check it out. So in general, when building your world, there are a couple of different approaches you could use, and there probably exists many approaches out there, but I have some specific ones that I would like to recommend, so we're going to look at those ones. Typically, world building gets divided into two ends of a spectrum, top and bottom. So you either start with a top to bottom approach or a bottom to top approach. So in a bottom to top approach, you might have an idea for a scene or a setting for a specific story moment surrounding some characters, and then the world will evolve and come from what the characters need and the setting demands. While in a top to bottom approach, you might take the big overview and define countries, religions and languages for your world, and then the story will be based on those world constructions. So like I mentioned in the last episode, people will typically start in either end of world building. So you could start with making the planets and the land masses, then the countries and then the cities, but you could also start your building from a city or a smaller village that maybe is closer to the action of your story. Both would be examples of top to bottom. It's just the second one, you're closer to that action and the story and you'll get there faster. Depending on your goal, starting at a certain scope can be really helpful to your efforts. You might not need to know about the solar systems and the planets surrounding your world if it's not essential to your story. A good rule of thumb is always to create one more layer than you need. If your characters will never grasp anything beyond countries, maybe visiting one other country, then you might not need to create the overall planet, but maybe creating the continent that these countries sit on, just a rough outline, might be really helpful, because at some point the story might demand that you ask what is next to these other countries, what's in between them. So just create that continent even though the characters don't have any concept of that continent. Now back to this top and bottom approach. You might be thinking maybe a balance in between them is good, and to some degree yes, a balanced approach is a good thing, but you also have to be careful that you don't create too much of a balance in between the two methods. Let me explain. An example of a balanced approach might be that you write out really big story beats for a character's actions, and then you do a little bit of world building around those actions. So for example, character A goes to city A and fights villain B, and then so on and so forth. And you could do that approach and it's great for outlining big chunks, but I think you'd quite quickly find that if you do that approach where you kind of do these bigger chunks and don't do too much detail in either the story or the world, then you will end somewhere pretty boring quite quickly. And I think we need that sense of excitement sometimes in our own work to keep us going. I think if you didn't spend the time to just focus on world building or just focus on the story, you're gonna miss out on those moments that makes our world feel special and unique and makes us kind of stick with the thing. So something to look out for. We'll talk more about this a little bit later, but just keep that in mind. For now, what I would recommend is a balanced ping pong method. Essentially, do a session of world building and then do some story after that, and then go back to world building and start building the world based on some of those story points, and then again back to story, them influencing each other. I think this approach is really nice, and it's definitely the one I use the most, and I think it also mimics the real world as much as possible. You know, the world is the way it is, but it's also shaped by our actions, and we can do things in the world based on what the world is like. So it's a constantly reinforcing synergy between the world and humans' actions. So to me, it just makes sense to go between the two methods and having them reinforce each other. Perhaps you're not interested in writing a story, you just want to purely world build, and that's totally fine too. But I will encourage you to use story as a tool to help your world building. You might discover something through the lens of your characters that you cannot see as a godlike being that knows everything. The approaches and methods to world building really fascinates me. I can see how I've developed my method over time and how it improved the quality of my work. But I actually always struggled to find the right balance between top bottom and bottom top. Hence why I've come up with this ping-ponging method, or balanced ping pong. But still, recently I've been analyzing my work methods and something still didn't quite fit. This method was missing a dimension. What would happen was that I would start to write down ideas and, fleshing out the world. And then I would get the urge to wanting to draw some of the things that I had written down. And while it does seem like a natural part of world building, I was actually not world building anymore. I was just showing the world, but it felt like a natural part of the process, but it wasn't somehow part of the process. And I actually found that drawing out the things and making it real did a lot for the quality of the world builds I was doing. And it hit me this was this extra dimension for my world building. This extra dimension is what I call the aesthetics. The aesthetics to me are the drawings, the paintings, the music, the texts you make as a part of the final product of your world. They're the things pushing towards the final product. At the end of the day, when you're done with all your aesthetics, you have the final product for your world. The aesthetics are what allows your audience to immerse themselves into your world and yourself. It acts as a confirmation that your world is going the right place by sitting down and maybe drawing something or writing a small piece of the story nicely so you can feel immersed in a more narrative way. So for example, we could write down the characteristics of Sauron's Dark Tower with the eye at the top, and then we could sit down and do a painting or a drawing of it to really help sell what it is we're thinking to both ourselves and the audience. Or you could write down a piece of text, a story moment of a character describing their experience with this tower. Both are ways for us to immerse ourselves into the world. And this concept I call the aesthetics of the world. The great thing about aesthetics is its immersive quality. It can help underline a good idea or make a not so great idea seem really cool just from its appearance. And as a tool for world builders, it gives you that confidence that your world will work. The same goes for writing your story. You could write your entire story down in bullet points, in rough outlines and so on, but sometimes writing down the story beat for beat in that specific story moment does something very different for the immersion. And it just captivates us in a very different way than what a bullet points could ever do. And you might experience something through how you wrote the characters talking. You might have an idea for one of your characters' personalities, but if you write it in a certain way and maybe you hear them speak it differently just from how you aesthetically wrote it, then maybe you're gonna change that character because maybe you like that better, or maybe you don't like that. You might learn something from bringing in some aesthetics into your work. Another example of this might be that you are game mastering a D&D campaign. So you're preparing your world, you're preparing the story, but you might not be drawing out everything, and you're not going to be writing something that all the players have to read out. They experience the world through mostly you, right? You're acting out the characters, the villains and the foes, and that acting out is part of the aesthetics of that D&D session. And so practicing, your voices and your body language, that's that aesthetic part that's gonna help immerse the players. So if we add aesthetics to our spectrum, we've now created a triforce of world building. And I've renamed top and bottom into world building story to keep everything clear, and then added aesthetics here. Hopefully all this makes sense. And if you have trouble remembering, then I've created an acronym and a metaphor for all this. And I call it the SAW method, standing for story, aesthetics, and world building. And you can think of it like this. The saw blade is the story. It has the teeth. It's what's actually conveying what you're trying to say. The handle is the world, and thereby the world building. It's what holds everything together. It's holding your story and the rules of how it can function. And the aesthetics is what the saw actually looks like. It's what makes you pick a specific saw over another saw from just a first impression. It's probably not until you use that saw you know if it's good or not, but the aesthetics help us make that early choice quite often. The reason why it's nice to think about world building in this way is because it makes us bounce between the different approaches, and it challenges our worlds and ideas from a different point of view. It lets us see the world from a different lens that asks unique questions that only a visual or a character in your story could ask. To be honest, I'm pretty happy with this method. Now, you might agree or disagree, you might see some holes in some of the arguments I made here, but this method works wonders for me. And for the duration of this series, I'll be using the SAW method to explain and build our world. Now, that is pretty much it for now, and we are so close to starting our world. In the very next episode, we'll be talking about the ideas and how to generate ideas, and we're using the SAW method to kind of guide our idea generation. So I hope you enjoyed watching this. I hope you learned something. And as always, thank you guys so much for watching. Bye.